The dust of redemption was a bitter thing, the color of rust and regret. It coated the girl's eyelashes, her chapped lips, the raw, rope-burned skin of her wrists. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a place where condemnation was the chief commodity. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer on an anvil of baked earth. She did not flinch from it. She had learned to make herself small, to retreat into a place deep inside where the heat and the jeers and the dry spit of the men gathered could not fully reach. She was a thing to be looked at, a piece of unfortunate property changing hands. Her gaze was fixed on a loose board in the porch of the general store across the way. It was a safer place to look than the faces in the crowd. Faces were mirrors of what you were, a disgrace, a burden, a mouth to feed that belonged to no one. She focused on the splintered wood the way the sun bleached it bone white. She felt the vibrations through the soles of her bare feet as men shifted their weight, their boots scuffing the ground. Their murmurs were a low hum, like angry wasps in a jar. Then, a small hand, gritty with dirt, slipped into her own. It was her brother's. He was all of 10 winters, thin as a fence rail, with eyes too old for his face. He stood beside her, a small, defiant shadow against the glare. He did not look at her. He looked past her at the men. His knuckles were white where he gripped her fingers. A large man with a florid face and a vest that strained at the buttons stepped forward. His name was Silas, and he smelled of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction. He was the one who had brought them here, after their father's fever had burned itself out, leaving nothing behind but debt. Last chance? Silas boomed, his voice slick with false bonhomie. Good stock. Strong girl. Just needs a firm hand. He gestured to her as if she were a mule. A few men chuckled. She did not move, did not breathe. She was a statue carved from stillness. Her brother let go of her hand. He took a single, shuddering step forward, into the open space between her and the crowd. His voice, when it came, was thin but piercing, the cry of a hawk. He looked at a man standing apart from the others, a man leaning against the farrier's wall, half lost in shadow. Please, the boy begged, his voice cracking on the word. Please take my sister as your wife, sir. She just turned 18-inch. A wave of cruel laughter rolled through the crowd. A wife. The idea was absurd. She was chattel, not a bride. She shut her eyes, the shame of physical heat on her skin worse than the sun. But the man in the shadows did not laugh. He pushed himself off the wall, and the simple movement seemed to pull all the sound from the air. The laughter died in men's throats. Silence fell, heavy and waiting. He was not a rich man, not by the look of him. His coat was a long, worn duster the color of the dirt road, frayed at the cuffs. His boots were scuffed and gray with dust. He wore a hat that shadowed a face carved with lines of grief and weariness, a face that had seen too many hard suns and long winters. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He was Elias Thorne, a name whispered in the town with a mix of pity and respect. A man who had buried his wife and child on the hill behind his homestead 2 years prior and had spoken little since. Elias walked slowly, deliberately into the center of the square. He did not look at Silas or the sneering men. His gaze fell first on the boy whose small frame was trembling with the sheer force of his audacity. Then his eyes lifted and met the girl's. She opened hers, startled by the sudden quiet. For a long-held breath, he just looked. He saw not the property Silas was selling, but the raw, abject misery, the stubborn flicker of life in eyes that were trying their hardest to be empty. He saw the ghost of another woman's fear. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally brushing over Silas. He reached into his coat. Not for a weapon, but for a small leather pouch. He undid the drawstring and tipped a few coins onto the top of a nearby rain barrel. They landed with a dull, final clink. Not enough for a bride. Barely enough for a horse. It was an insult. I'll take her, Elias said. His voice was low, rough, like it came from under floorboards. It was not an offer. It was a statement. Silas's face purpled. The paltry sum was a public refutation of his prize. Now hold on, Thorne. That ain't half the debt. Elias's eyes, cold as river stone, settled on him. He said nothing. He simply waited. The silence stretched, thin and tight. In that quiet, Silas saw something he could not bully, something that would not bend. He saw a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Silas swallowed, his bluster deflating like a pricked bladder. He grumbled, but he stepped back. Elias moved to the hitching post. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his trousers. He did not touch her. He simply sawed at the coarse rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted with a rasping sound. When the rope fell away, her hands dropped to her sides, limp and useless. The raw red marks on her skin looked like brands. She stood there, untethered, blinking in the harsh light. Freedom felt like a terrifying, open space. Her brother rushed to her side, pressing his face into the thin fabric of her dress. Elias looked at the boy. "You too," he said, the words an afterthought. He turned and started walking away, not looking back to see if they followed. He did not have to. Where else was there to go? The journey was a silent procession of three. Elias in the lead, his long strides eating up the dusty road. The girl followed a few paces behind, her bare feet finding a path through the sharpest stones. The boy trailed after her, his small hand clutching a fold of her ragged dress. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they were leaving behind. The landscape was a character in their quiet drama. It was harsh and unforgiving, a canvas of browns and grays under an immense, indifferent sky. The wind turned mean as they left the meager shelter of the town, whispering of isolation and hardship. It pulled at the girl's hair, plastered her thin dress to her frame. She shivered, though the sun was still high. Elias walked at a steady pace, never slowing, but never pulling so far ahead that they might lose sight of him. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun. The silence was not empty, it was filled with the scuff of their feet, the whine of the wind, and the unspoken questions that hung between them. She watched his back. It was broad and straight, a wall between her and the world they had left. But it was a stranger's back. When the sun began to dip toward the jagged horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, he stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder. He turned, his face unreadable in the dying light, and held it out to her. He did not speak. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting from the canteen to his face. It was the first gesture of kindness she had received from anyone but her brother in longer than she could remember. It felt foreign, dangerous. But her throat was a desert. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, calloused. She drank, the water cool and tasting of metal and earth. She drank until her thirst was a memory, then handed it to her brother, who drank just as greedily. When she held it back out to Elias, their eyes met again. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the closest she could come to thanks. He took the canteen, capped it, and turned to walk on. They arrived as dusk was settling into a deep, velvety dark. The homestead was more a suggestion than a structure. A small, weathered cabin huddled against the base of a low hill, its wood bleached gray by sun and wind. A lean-to stable stood nearby, and a stone chimney breathed a thin plume of smoke from some banked fire within. On the hill just above the cabin, two simple wooden crosses stood stark against the sky. The place was a reflection of the man who owned it. Isolated, functional, haunted. It did not look like a home. It looked like a place to wait. Elias pushed open the cabin door, which groaned in protest. He stood aside to let them enter. The inside was one room, spare and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire murmuring within it. There was a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few plates and tins. The air smelled of wood smoke, old sorrow, and soap. He gestured toward the table. On it sat a loaf of dark bread and a small wheel of cheese. It was a feast. He pointed to a small alcove near the hearth where a pile of clean but worn blankets lay folded. "You'll sleep there," he said to them both. He did not assign her a place near his own bed, but in the communal space with her brother by the warmth of the fire. It was a promise of safety delivered without the words. She watched him as he moved about the small space. He took a bowl, ladled some stew from a pot hanging over the fire, and set it on the table for the boy. He did the same for her. Then he sat in one of the two chairs, leaving the other for them to share or negotiate. He ate his own meal standing by the hearth, his back mostly to them. She guided her brother to the chair, and they ate in silence, ravenously. The stew was thin but hot. It warmed her from the inside out, chasing away some of the deep, settled chill. She did not know what this place was, what she was meant to be here. A wife, her brother had offered. A servant was more likely. But for tonight, there was a locked door. No, she noticed the door had no lock, just a simple latch, a solid roof, and a full belly. He did not lock doors. The thought settled in her, a small, strange comfort. He was not a jailer. When they were finished, she took their bowls to a wash basin in the corner. She washed them carefully, the warm, soapy water a luxury on her hands. She did not know the rules of this new life, so she made them up as she went, based on the simple currency of work. You earn your keep. You stay quiet. You make yourself useful. Later, huddled under the blankets with her brother's sleeping form pressed against her, she watched the firelight dance across the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Elias was a silhouette in his chair, staring into the flames. He had not spoken another word to her. He had simply provided food, warmth, a space where no one could get at her. It was an unspoken contract, written in gestures, not ink. She did not know his grief, and he did not know her terror. They were two strangers stitched together by a desperate plea and a handful of coins. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind outside and the steady, quiet breathing of the man across the room. The days settled into a rhythm as predictable and quiet as the rising and setting of the sun. A life began to take shape in the silence, built not on words but on shared tasks and parallel motion. She would rise before him when the light was still a pale gray wash over the eastern hills. She would stir the embers in the hearth, add wood, and put the coffee on to boil. The smell of it would fill the small cabin, a simple, domestic perfume that seemed to fight against the lingering scent of sorrow. He would rise and nod to her, a barely perceptible acknowledgement, before pulling on his boots and heading out to the barn. She learned his routines by observation. He tended to the 2 milk cows and the sturdy gelding, his movements economical and sure. She took over the house. She swept the floor until the packed earth was smooth and clean. She scrubbed the tabletop, patched the worn spots in their blankets with thread she found in a dusty sewing box. The box had belonged to someone else. She could feel the ghost of other hands on the silver thimble, the small, rusted scissors. She did not let herself think on it too long. She found the garden. It was a small, fallow patch behind the house, choked with weeds, the fence around it collapsing. But the earth was dark and rich. At its edge was the hill with the 2 crosses. One was larger, one painfully small. She understood. This was his wife's garden. She started by pulling the weeds, her hands raw by the end of the first day. She worked until her back ached and her mind was blessedly empty. Elias noticed. He said nothing, but the next morning, a hoe and a small hand trowel were leaning against the back wall of the cabin. The tools were old, but the metal was clean, sharpened. A silent offering. A permission. Her brother, whose name was Finn, found his own place. He was too small for heavy chores, but he followed Elias like a shadow, carrying tools, opening gates, his boyish chatter a stark contrast to the quiet of the adults. Elias never told him to be quiet. He listened, sometimes answering the boy's endless questions with a short phrase or a simple nod. He was teaching the boy to be a man, and the boy was teaching him to speak again. One afternoon, as she was mending one of Finn's torn shirts, she began to hum. It was a tune she did not realize she remembered, something from before. A simple, meandering melody. She stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat, realizing the sound she had made in the quiet house. She glanced toward the door, where Elias was mending a piece of harness, his large hands surprisingly deft. He did not look up, but the steady rhythm of his work had paused for a beat. Then it resumed. He had heard. He had not chided her. The silence he kept was not an angry one. It was a vast, open space, and she was slowly learning she was allowed to fill a small corner of it. Small gestures became their language. He would leave an extra piece of wood for the fire on cold nights. She would leave a hot plate of food for him on the table when he came in late from the fields, covering it with another plate to keep it warm. One day, she found a small, stubborn wildflower growing by the fence line. She picked it and, her heart hammering, walked up the small hill. She placed the tiny blue flower at the base of the larger of the 2 crosses. She did not stay long. But as she walked back to the cabin, she felt his eyes on her. It was not a look of anger or trespass, but of something else she could not name. A shared acknowledgement of the ghosts they both lived with. The town was a distant memory, but its judgment had long arms. Once a week, Elias would ride in for supplies. The first time he went alone. The second time, she handed him a list, written carefully on a scrap of paper. Flour, salt, thread. He came back with everything on the list, and one thing that was not. A pair of sturdy leather shoes, just her size. He left them by the door without a word. She stared at them for a long time before trying them on. They fit perfectly. They felt like an anchor. One evening, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised, angry purple. Rain came down in solid sheets, and the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a living thing with a mean voice. Finn, terrified of thunder, had crawled under the blankets in their alcove. She sat by the fire, watching the water snake down the single window pane. Elias sat at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape a steady sound against the chaos outside. The fire cast long, dancing shadows. In the flickering light, his face looked older, the lines of grief cut deeper. A particularly loud clap of thunder shook the small cabin, and she jumped, a small, sharp cry escaping her lips before she could stop it. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heart racing. The sound had thrown her back to another time, another place of violence and fear. Elias's hands stilled on the knife. He looked at her, his expression softening in the firelight. "It's just the sky," he said, his voice low and calm. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight. She stared into the fire, trying to will the trembling in her hands to stop. She felt like wet paper, ready to tear. "You're safe here," he said, repeating the vow he'd made once before. It was more than a statement of fact, it was a promise he was renewing. She found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Why," she whispered, the question that had lived in her since that first day. "Why did you take me?" He set the knife and stone down on the table. He was quiet for a long time, listening to the rain and the fire. He looked toward the darkened window as if he could see the two graves through the wood and the storm. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "she was a kind woman. Too kind for this land. When the fever came, she was scared. And I couldn't stop it." He paused, swallowing hard. "The day I saw you, you had the same look in your eyes. And the boy, he looked like a boy ought to look. Hopeful. I couldn't let the world stamp that out of him. Not that day." It was more than he had ever said at one time. It was a piece of his broken heart, offered up in the dim light of the cabin. She finally understood. It wasn't about her. Not really. It was about his wife. It was about a debt he felt he owed to the world, a wrong he was trying to right. It was an act of penance. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Her name was Lena," she said quietly. He looked at her, confused. "Who?" "My mother," she clarified. "My name is Alara." He let the name settle in the air between them. "Alara," he repeated softly. It was the first time he had called her anything. It was a naming. In the warm, firelit cabin, surrounded by the storm, two solitary ghosts had finally learned each other's names. A foundation of trust, laid stone by quiet stone, was finally settling. The rain eventually softened and the thunder rumbled away into the distance. Inside, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer empty. It was shared. The quiet peace they had built was as fragile as a skim of ice on morning water. It was shattered by the sight of three riders on the horizon, dark shapes moving slowly against the pale sky. Alara saw them first from the garden. Her hand, holding the trowel, froze mid-motion. Her blood went cold. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, who they were. She straightened up slowly, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures. She did not run. The instinct to flee was a physical thing, a screaming in her veins, but she stood her ground. This was her home now. This small patch of tilled earth, this stubborn garden coaxed back to life, was hers. She would not abandon it. Elias came out of the barn, a bucket of milk in one hand. He saw the direction of her gaze and set the bucket down carefully. His face became a mask of stone, his eyes narrowing. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked to stand beside her, his presence a solid, unmoving wall. Finn, who had been playing by the woodpile, saw the change in them and ran to Alara's side, hiding behind her skirts. The riders were Silas and two of his hired men. They pulled up their horses a dozen yards from the cabin, turning the small yard into a battleground. Silas sat his horse with a smug arrogance, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He had come to reclaim what he saw as his property. "Thorn," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I've come to collect my due. The debt is paid. I'll be taking the girl." He spoke of her as if she were a sack of flour he had left in storage. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply stood, a bulwark between them and Alara. "She's not yours to take," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I have the paper. The debt her father owed. You paid a pittance, a down payment. I was feeling charitable that day. My charity has run out." He patted a folded document in his vest pocket. "It's legal. She's mine until the full amount is settled." His argument was one of ownership of a contract written by cruel men in a cruel world. Elias took a half-step forward. "This is my land. She is under my protection. You are not welcome here. Leave." "Protection?" Silas sneered, his eyes sliding over to Alara, lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I think she needs protection from a grieving man playing house. I'll give her a real home." It was then that something inside Alara broke. Not in a way that left her shattered, but in a way that let something new and fierce rush in. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by a hot, bright rage. She was not a sack of flour. She was not a name on a piece of paper. She was Alara. Before Elias could respond, she stepped out from behind him. Her movement was so unexpected that all four men fell silent, watching her. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her chin was high. Finn still clung to her dress, a small, warm anchor. She looked directly at Silas, her eyes burning. "I am not a thing," she said, her voice shaking but clear. It was the first time she had spoken in defiance, the first time she had claimed her own voice in the face of a man who sought to silence her. Silas was taken aback, his smile faltering. "You'll do as you're told, girl." He started to dismount, one of his men moving to do the same. Elias's hand moved, not to a gun, but to a heavy wood axe that was leaning against the chopping block nearby. He didn't lift it. He just rested his hand on the handle. The gesture was calm, almost casual, but its meaning was unmistakable. "I said, leave," Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl. But the deciding action came from Alara. As Silas took a step toward her, his hand outstretched to grab her arm, she did not flinch or retreat. Her eyes darted to the side, to the porch steps where she had left her gardening tools. In one swift, fluid motion, she bent down, her hand closing around the handle of the heavy iron trowel Elias had sharpened for her. She rose, holding it not like a tool but like a weapon. Its sharp point was aimed squarely at Silas's chest. "You will not touch me," she said, and this time her voice did not shake. It was steady. It was cold. It was the voice of a woman who had found the edge of her fear and had stepped over it. The sight of her, the quiet, cowed girl he remembered, now standing with fire in her eyes and a weapon in her hand, stopped Silas cold. His bravado was built on the expectation of weakness, of compliance. He did not know what to do with this defiant woman or the silent, waiting man beside her who looked ready to split him in two. His men shifted uncomfortably on their horses, looking at Silas, their confidence wavering. This was not the easy work they had signed up for. The standoff stretched, the silence thick with unspoken violence. From the corner of her eye, Alara saw movement down the dusty track that led to their homestead. It was their closest neighbor, a man named Henderson, carrying a rifle loosely in the crook of his arm. He had seen the riders. He stopped a short distance away, saying nothing, just watching. His presence shifted the odds. It was no longer 2 against 3. It was a community, however small, closing ranks. Silas saw him too. He saw the woman who would not break, the man who would not bend, and the neighbor who had come to bear witness. His claim, based on paper and pride, felt thin and worthless against the solid reality of their stand. He was a coward at his core, a bully who only fought battles he was sure he could win. This was not one of them. With a curse, he spat on the ground. "She ain't worth the trouble," he snarled, trying to save face. He yanked his horse's head around and spurred it back the way he had come, his men scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of ignominious dust in their wake. Alara stood watching them go until they were just specks on the horizon. The trowel felt heavy in her hand. Slowly she lowered it, her arm trembling from the strain. The strength that had flooded her drained away, leaving her shaky and breathless. Elias turned to her. His face was no longer a stone mask. There was a look in his eyes she had never seen before, a deep, resounding pride. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the trowel from her grasp. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, warm contact. "You didn't run," he said, his voice quiet with wonder. "I had nowhere to run to," she whispered, looking around at the small cabin, the tilled earth, the wide sky. "This is home." He nodded slowly, his gaze following hers. He looked at her, then at Finn, who was still peeking out from behind her, and then at the house they had defended together. A quiet understanding passed between them, deeper than any words. They had faced the past and had not flinched. The threat was gone, repelled not by violence, but by the unyielding force of two broken people who had decided to stand as one. That evening, as they ate their meal by the fire, the silence was not just comfortable. It was triumphant. In the days that followed the confrontation, the air in the small cabin changed. The quiet that had once been a space to hide in became a space to live in. The unspoken contract of provision and shelter had been fulfilled and was now replaced by something deeper, a bond forged in shared defiance. The house, which had long felt like it was holding its breath, breathed again. One evening, a few weeks later, Elias was sitting on the porch steps, watching the last light bleed from the sky. Alara came out and sat on the step below him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. For a long time, they just watched the stars begin to prick the deep indigo canvas above. "He won't come back," Elias said, breaking the comfortable silence. But others like him exist. The paper he holds, it could still cause trouble. She knew he was right. Her freedom was a fragile thing, built on their shared strength but not yet recognized by the world. She waited. "We should get married," he said, his voice even practical. He wasn't looking at her, but at the horizon. "Before a preacher. Make it binding. No one can claim a man's wife." She turned her head to look at his profile, silhouetted against the gloaming. It was a proposal born of pragmatism, an extension of his protection. But she heard the unspoken thing beneath it, the desire to make their fragile home permanent, to give it a name the world would have to honor. It was not a declaration of sweeping passion, but of steady, quiet devotion. It was far more valuable. "Yes," she said simply. The word was small, but it held the weight of her entire future. He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she saw a flicker of relief, of profound gratitude in his eyes. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand in his. His grasp was warm and firm, his callous palm enveloping her smaller one. It was not the touch of an owner, but of a partner. The next week, they rode into town together. They did not go to the town square where she had been shamed, but to the small, dusty church at its edge. The preacher was a weary-looking man with kind eyes who asked few questions. Finn stood as their witness, his face solemn and proud. The vows they spoke were simple, the traditional words feeling both ancient and entirely new. When Elias slipped a simple, thin gold band onto her finger, his mother's, he'd told her, not his first wife's, it was the sealing of a promise that had been made long ago on a dusty patch of land with a trowel and a wood axe. Their life together was not reborn in a flash of fire, but in a series of small, deliberate acts of creation. The day after the wedding, Elias tore down the last of the rotted fence around the garden and, together, they built a new one, its posts straight and true. She planted seeds in the dark earth, seeds for vegetables to see them through the winter, and seeds for flowers, bright patches of color that defied the muted landscape. One afternoon, she took down the faded, water-stained curtains on the cabin window. She used the fabric from a dress she would never wear again to sew new ones, a pale yellow that caught the afternoon sun. When she hung them, the light that filtered into the room seemed warmer, softer. Elias came in from the fields and stopped in the doorway, just looking at the splash of color. He didn't say a word, but a slow smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing. He was not just living in a shelter anymore, he was living in a home. The ultimate change, the final stitching together of their makeshift family, came from Finn. He had taken to calling Elias by his name, but one evening as Elias was showing him how to carve a small bird from a piece of scrap wood, Finn looked up at him, his face serious. "When I grow up," he said, "I'm going to build a house just like this one, Pa." The word hung in the air. Pa. Elias's hands stilled, the knife resting on the wood. He looked at Finn and then his eyes lifted to meet Alara's across the room. She saw a storm of emotion in his gaze, the old grief, the new hope, the shock of a name he never thought he would hear again. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just reached out and rested his hand on Finn's head, a simple, profound blessing. The hole in his heart, the one carved out by loss, was not gone, but it was no longer an empty void. It was being filled. The final image of their new beginning was not one of grand celebration, but of quiet, settled peace. Winter had come, blanketing the land in a soft, forgiving layer of snow. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled brightly in the hearth. Elias sat in his chair, reading from a worn book by the light of the flames. Finn was asleep in his alcove, the carved wooden bird clutched in his hand. Alara sat on a braided rug by the fire, mending a tear in Elias's coat. The room was warm, filled with the smell of baking bread and wood smoke. She finished her stitch, knotted the thread, and leaned her head back against his knee. He stopped reading and let his hand rest on her hair. They sat like that for a long time, in the shared, breathing silence of their home. The ghosts were still there, on the hill outside, but they were no longer haunting the house. They were just memories, a part of the story that had brought them here. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And in the heart of that harsh, unforgiving land, they had found it. They had found each other. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. That's too easy a tale to tell. It's about how real salvation is quieter and far more difficult. It's about being given not a hand to pull you up, but just a piece of solid ground to stand on so you can find your own feet. It's the story of how a home isn't four walls and a roof, but a shared silence, a meal left warm on the table, a weapon held in your defense. So here is your naming. All of us, at some point, are tied to a post in the middle of town, with the crowd judging and our worth being debated by fools. We are all, in some quiet corner of our hearts, just looking for that one person who sees past the ropes, who offers not pity, but a simple, unspoken promise: you are safe here. Life doesn't offer many grand heroes. It offers quiet, broken people who, on a good day, have just enough strength to share. And if you are brave enough to accept that quiet strength, if you are brave enough to tend a dead garden and stand your ground when the past comes riding back for you, you might just find that you are not building a life from scraps. You are building a fortress. You are building a family. You are building a home right there in the heart of the wilderness.